Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Andy, and thanks so much for having us today. We're really excited to have the opportunity to talk with you, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces, so thanks for coming out. The reason for coming together originated with our book, and like many books, this is a product of many long years of labor, and so that's part of why this is exciting for us. We started to work on this project in 2009 with a team of people, and so, very briefly, I want to start by just acknowledging some of the folks who were helpful to us in getting to the point where we are now. So certainly the Institute for Research on Higher Education, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, which is where Joni worked before she came to Penn, and her work there with Measuring Up was really a foundation for the work that we did in this book. We also had a terrific team of doctoral students who have now graduated and moved on, and then a wonderful advisory board. We also, so for the what we drew on for the book was a series of case studies. We looked at state policy in 5 different states, and so we're very grateful to the folks who we interviewed, the folks who shared information, the folks who took our calls again and again as we're trying to understand what was happening, and then others who provided feedback on drafts. So I just want to begin by giving you a little bit of our orientation as to how we were understanding and what we were trying to do. So we were guided by at least 3 premises on this. So one is this assumption that higher education really is one of the most important issues to our well-being as individuals and as a society. So as we all know, higher education has lots of benefits to individuals, but also higher education is key to our economic and social prosperity as communities. The second premise related to that is that public policy really is the lever that we need and we can use to try to get to the level of educational attainment that we need as a society. And so in the book, if you've had a chance to take a look, we document how the educational needs of our society are growing. Another important concern is the persisting gaps in educational attainment across groups, and so we argue that we can't get to where we need in terms of educational attainment as a society without closing these persisting gaps. And so our premise is that public policy really is the mechanism that we have to look at in terms of understanding how we get to where we need in terms of overall attainment and closing gaps across groups. The third premise is that state policy really is what we should be focusing on. Clearly, federal policy matters. I've spent a lot of time, and others, and Joni we've all looked at federal policy, particularly the federal financial aid programs, and a lot of money is spent on those. But our premise is that if we're really going to make progress on improving higher education attainment, we have to focus on the states. The states have the primary responsibility for the educational attainment of their populations. From a research perspective, focusing on states is also a good idea because we have so much variation across states. And part of what we try to do in this study is capitalize on that variation to first try to probe what's happening within particular states with regard to the relationship between public policy and attainment, and then draw lessons across those 5 states. And we have 5 very different stories about the relationship between policy and attainment. But our challenge was to try to think about, well, what can we say based on these 5 in-depth studies that might be applicable across all 5 states and then across 50 states more generally. And so in terms of that cross-case analysis, this is the conceptual model that we produce in the book from that look across states. The outcome that we're really interested in trying to influence here is overall higher education attainment and the gap, improving equity in attainment across groups. So that's really what we're trying to figure out, how to understand, what is the relationship between public policy and those outcomes. Our model has 5 basic premises to it. So one is that context matters. So our 5 states, and our 5 states were Georgia, Illinois, Texas, Washington, and Maryland. They're all very, very different states in terms of their economic, political, social, historical context. They also have very different higher education systems. And so in order to understand how policy might make a difference, first you have to recognize that these are very different types of places, and any intervention has to recognize those differences in context. A second theme that emerged from our study is that state policy leadership and steering also matter. So all states are doing things right now. States have a number of different policies in place, but what seems to matter is the extent to which there is a public agenda for higher education, so a plan for that identifies goals of increasing attainment and closing gaps across groups, and a shared understanding among key stakeholders in the state that those are important goals, and then mechanisms that direct policies towards achieving those goals. The third premise is that policy does matter, and we identify 3 different categories of policies. They're shown here in those green circles. So the one has to do with strategic use of fiscal resources. So states have a variety of different mechanisms that they can use to improve the affordability of higher education. This really gets at the extent to which and how states are using appropriations to institutions, tuition, and financial aid. So those are the primary types of fiscal policy levers. One of our premises of the book that I didn't mention is that we argue that there's not one single strategy that's going to work here. We really need to be taking a comprehensive approach. So if you buy the book and you're hoping that at the end we'll say, if you just do ABC, you'll solve this, that's not, you'll be disappointed. But we do identify these broad lessons that within those categories, I think that there are some helpful recommendations for how states move forward with these things. So that first category is around using the fiscal resources that are available strategically to improve higher education attainment. The second big category of policies has to do with the preparation and movement of students across K through 12 in higher education, and then within our higher education system. So lots of students are lost, basically, as they try to move from our K through 12 to our higher education systems. And then once they get into higher education, as they try to move across institutions. So in the book, we talk about different types of policies and strategies that states should think about in terms of how to ensure that better alignment so that students can move through our complex, diverse system without loss of academic credit. The third category of policies has to do with what we call here the optimization of system capacity. And this really has to do with the matching the availability of higher education institutions and opportunities within the state with the educational needs of a population. In various different forms, all of our states were trying to figure out how to better align the resources that it has in terms of higher education opportunities with the educational needs of the state. One of the assumptions that we have in this work is that states are not magically going to have additional fiscal resources to invest in building new institutions. So part of the challenge is to try to understand what are the resources that are here right now and use those better to try to achieve this goal of improving overall attainment and greater equity and attainment across groups. So that's our third assumption, that these types of policies matter. Our fourth premise is really emphasizing how these policies have to be oriented towards equity. And so, there are policies in place right now that are perhaps contributing to, or that we're not doing enough in terms of closing gaps across groups. Certainly the failure to figure out how to strategically use available fiscal resources to improve college affordability disproportionately impacts those from low-income families. Our failure to figure out how to ensure that students can move through our system efficiently without loss of credit disproportionately influences opportunity for those who are least well served right now. And our inability to figure out how to ensure the availability of high quality post-secondary options for everyone in a state disproportionately affects those who have the fewest opportunities. So that's the fourth theme. And then the final theme is this feedback loop. So this is not a static process. Once the state figures out how to do it, it's not over. Our context is changing, our populations are changing, our educational needs are changing. And so the fifth premise is that we have to continue to pay attention to these relationships, use our data to monitor effectiveness and make changes as appropriate.
welcome. I'm so glad you could be here today to join us in this conversation. Did you just use the arrow keys? Oh, okay. Okay, so we picked these states for a variety of reasons. And we tried to look at important variations in terms of states. And I want to mention 3 today, even though they varied in other ways as well. They varied in political culture, they varied in terms of region of the country, they varied in terms of the type of economy they had. I might add that since this study took place, while the book was in publication, I worked with some graduate students who are here today, both in a public policy class and after that to add California to this list. So we have a number of states. So while, as Laura said, 5 or 6 states may not be completely representative of the nation, based on my experience of 25 plus years, I can tell you that there's no state that doesn't face the sort of problems Laura outlined in the previous slide in terms of the conceptual framework. But one factor, one variable that we looked at was the percentage of the population with at least an associate's degree. And you can see that we have as many states above the line as below the national average, so we had wide variation on that. In fact, Maryland is number 1 in the country in terms of educational attainment of their population. Washington is fairly high, it's 42%. They tend to import a lot of their talent rather than educate it. California is on this list. It's, if it were on this list, it would be right at the national average at 38%. So they varied in terms of the percent of the population that had education and attainment. And what you'll also notice from the book, there's some data in the book about what demands are there for an educated workforce in each state. And that varies a great deal based on their current levels of education attainment and where the strength of the education is, whether it's in the young population or the older population. It varies in terms of the type of economy they have. So this is really the educational capital that states have to draw upon for their workforce and for their civil society. And it's not enough, and it's not keeping up with other countries. And we also try to make that point in the book. These states vary quite a bit in terms of demographics, the population, and in terms of just the absolute percent of blacks and Hispanics, as well as what is projected in the pipeline from high school graduates, young high school graduates. So in our sample, Georgia has the highest population of African Americans in the United States. And as a percentage, they're, of course, very high too, and actually growing with that regard. And Texas has the second highest, largest Hispanic population in the United States. California has the first. So you can see they varied quite a bit. We can also see some very large growth rates over, from 2005 to 2022. Now, there are some states in the country that are not going to see projected growth in the young population. And in order to reach their attainment goals, we'll really have to dive down into the adult population and encourage more people into post-secondary education. Actually, that's an agenda for all states. But these states in particular also have to focus on their young people. You can see that our states relied very heavily on their community college systems. In terms of system design, most of these states put most of their students in community colleges. So that's very consistent with the national average. Georgia's slightly below the national average. If you add California, it's above the national average in terms of enrollment in community colleges. We have a couple of states, Illinois and, Illinois and California, if it were on here, that also rely fairly heavily on private, not-for-profit institutions. Over 10% of the population would be in those institutions. And 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't even had this last category, private for-profit. But increasingly, we're seeing growth in that category, and that's becoming a major player in states, and states are trying to figure out how to utilize those institutions as well in terms of system optimization to improve education attainment. So it does matter how states design their systems in order to get this job done. Whoops. I think that's it. Okay, those are the major variables that we're going to talk about today, and there are more in the book. But right now, we wanted to get into a conversation. We wanted to just whet your appetite here this morning, or here this afternoon, and we want to pose some questions to our panelists, and we agreed that we would keep these responses fairly concise and provocative, and get through a few rounds of questioning, and then really try to engage in a dialogue with all of you. That's really our purpose here. So I want to start with Wendell. Wendell, we talked about the centrality of state policy leadership in higher education. And based on your experience as a chancellor of a public institution in New Jersey, how important is that for really improving these outcomes, education attainment, and closing gaps in equity from your perspective?
So first, I want to congratulate the two of you on this really important book, and I hope that this is an example of lots of events where there are lots of people talking about it, because they should be. And to answer your question, state policy is extremely important. Before I give a little bit more of an answer, I want to point out that I'm actually doing double duty today. I have my class that I'm teaching right now, which is here, and there's 17 of them that are here, and they're going to be ready to ask lots of questions. So I'm going to be brief so that you can hear their questions. Yeah. But to give a little bit more, state policy making is extremely important. That's the short answer. The longer answer is I think that it is, as you found, extremely idiosyncratic. And their states have so many different approaches. And while I completely agree that context matters, that statement that you made and that you show, it frustrated me as a chancellor how little we shared information among states or among institutions in different states, which is again why your book is so important, because in every single state, everybody believes that their answers are the only ones. There aren't other things that are happening in other states. And two, even if there are, they're not applicable.
Yeah.
And so while the context really does matter, the reality is that 18-year-old students or 25-year-old students or 40-year-old students across the country are much more similar than they are different. And I think that we need to be sharing a lot more best practices than we have been. So again, that's why I think your book is really important.
Great. Okay, Laura, I'd like to propose a question to you. How can states, a part of what we looked at is how well states get students into, have pathways into either technical or degree programs that prepare them for the workforce. Mm-hmm. And what is the role of state policy leadership with regard to doing that?
Well, I think you really hit on it when you called out the role of the two-year colleges. A lot of, for many students in their post-secondary experience, their first post-secondary experience is at a two-year college. And I think it matters a lot if they enter a functional environment, essentially, where there is that public agenda that you talked about, that state agenda where the goals are clear, and where the relationship between two-year colleges and four-year colleges is specified. Now, I know there's been a lot of debate in the world of community college policy about, should community colleges be primarily vocational and technical, or should their role be to guide students into four-year programs? And I think that in some ways that's kind of a false dichotomy, because a really strong community college system is able to cater to the needs of the students where they are, and the students who are oriented toward their workplace will be able to, through guidance and through counseling, identify themselves and those who are, and they may end up then going into a workplace and also pursuing a 4-year degree at the same time. So I think that to recognize those, policy that recognizes those subtleties is extremely important. And I guess from my own research, I want to point to the example of North Carolina, because I think there's a really wide range of performances among states in the 2-year college systems. And I've done, and just to say, it might be sort of strange from your perspective that there is a professor from the School of Design at a forum on education attainment, but I should say I teach in city and regional planning, and my specialization is labor markets and workforce development. So I've actually done some research with a colleague at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, on the biopharmaceutical sector. Why has it, and which is one of the big growth industries and innovative knowledge industries in the country right now. And the North Carolina's community college system, and actually there's an organization called the Biotech Center, which was established in Chapel Hill in 1981, and it does a variety of things, but one of the things that it did early and that it continues to do is establish a partnership with the state, both the 4-year public colleges and the community colleges in North Carolina. And it's developed a range of programs that's actually in conjunction with industry, that's tailored to the workforce needs of those industries, and many of them lead to 2 or 4-year degree attainment, and all these programs lead to jobs. So at the same time that these programs are encouraging post-secondary degree attainment among recent high school graduates, and in some cases workers that have been laid off from shrinking industries like textiles and furniture, which are big in North Carolina, they're also actually encouraging employers and influencing employer behavior. They encourage employers to support more inclusive hiring strategies. Why don't you consider this 2-year college graduate who has a specialized certification that's been developed with the help of your industry, as opposed to sort of throwing out all the resumes that have associate's degree on them and then going immediately for the bachelor's degree. I mean, that's really an important aspect. If the 2-year colleges can actually form the kind of relationships with employers where they're getting employers to consider hiring people with the 2-year degree, but with the industry experience and the internship and the specialized skills, I think that's a huge leap forward in policy. So. I guess I have some questions that I might learn from reading the book, but one of them that I have is the structure of a community college system. I know some states have a statewide community college system structure, whereas others run it essentially by county. I think in Pennsylvania it's done county by county. And I'm wondering of you whether you think that there's one mode that's more effective than the other in terms of management of 2-year college systems.
Well, yeah, we did certainly see variations of performance, whether you can isolate it at that level or not. I think certainly in Texas in the affordability, but before we go there to talk more about some of these specific results, I wanted to ask Laura to talk a little bit about some of the feedback we got from the states about this study.
So let me just tell you the chapter, if you haven't looked at the book, the headings for each of the chapters, and maybe then you can guess what you can try to figure out what reactions may have been. So in Illinois, a story of decline. So Illinois was a high-performing state in the 90s, and it's really had some I think we were there in a very, very low point in the state. Georgia, perpetuating disparity. Maryland, much accomplished, much at stake. Texas, hard choices ahead, and Washington, state leadership vacuum.
Didn't pull any punches.
Yeah. So the people in Washington were pretty upset. The state policy leaders, they made it clear to us that they were upset in a variety of different ways. They contacted the funders of the study to let them know that they weren't happy with us. We got a call to come and visit with the people, with some of the employers and the Gates Foundation there. I went. I was very nervous.
You said Laura. But yeah, this was actually a letter written by the governor, and the governor happened to be chair of the National Governors Association at that time, and her agenda for the country was to improve college completion rates. And so we came in and talked about the state policy vacuum in Washington.
Right.
So that became real problematic, but we heard from other states as well, so.
Well, so, even in Washington, it didn't end up being, come and chew me out to my face. It was more of a conversation. Well, we recognize that we have to be doing better. And, the folks, some of the large employers who were there were really interested. Well, what is the role of business in trying to move this forward? It was an encouraging conversation, although kind of like the chapter implies, I don't think anything happened after that, right? So I left kind of excited and then nothing. Illinois was the first state that we wrote up as a case study, and coincidentally I had the opportunity to present at the University of Illinois pretty much as we were drying the ink on the paper. I went and presented, and folks from the Illinois Board of Higher Education Commission were there, and the general sentiment was we got the story right, so that was reassuring. In Maryland, which is, when we're presenting on this, we tend to get questions, so what good news do you have? Is there any state we can point to as a positive example? And Maryland has some things going on, especially with its plan for financing higher education, that we tend to point to. I happened to be talking to a former state policy official in Maryland about a month ago, and I brought up this, well, we point to Maryland for these things. She's like, really? We have so many issues that we have to be doing better on. And so I think in some senses it's been reassuring that I do think we've gotten some feedback that we've gotten the story right. There's also a recognition that these are hard issues and people to varying, but the extent to which folks are trying to figure out how to productively move forward with them varies.
I think we have to realize how difficult this is. I mean, to a large degree, this is a political problem that we have. It's not that we don't know how to do this. We don't know everything, but we know a lot that we could be doing. And I had to speak to a group of state higher education officials this summer, and we had people from Maryland, Washington, and Texas on the panel reacting to the book. And they did a videotape, and the people on the panel were careful to edit this before this videotape were posted, because they were afraid of, how people in this state would react. For instance, in Texas, we took on their initiative to expand the research sector of the state when they have a very large underserved population of Latino students. And that had to be carefully phrased and carefully edited after the program, because it's hard to have these conversations because we had legislators from those states. Every legislator wants a research university in their district. I mean, that's, substituting for economic development and economic growth. Some of my colleagues here who helped me with a California case study, we heard directly from Janet Napolitano that we did not understand the role of the research university, and that their role is primarily research, not undergraduate education, and it was the state who cut them in undergraduate education. So lo and behold, this year they've admitted 30% out-of-state students that they can charge full freight. And we also heard in that state from Jerry Brown's office, the governor's office, and that he's trying to work with each of these sectors, and they're not ready to declare the master plan dead. He thinks these sectors can be revived and somehow address the needs of California in the face of overwhelming evidence that that's not likely. So we did get some pushback, but the state policy leadership thing I just want to expand on for just briefly, because it's not just one governor, it's not just one legislative session. This is over time how the state deals with higher education. And that's why the example of Maryland was so important. They have had strong, consistent, productive relationships between the state and higher education leaders, and there's a real dialogue going on in the state. So I'm going to shut up and ask our panelists more questions. So I want to start with Wendell again. So Wendell, you had to deal with some pretty difficult issues in New Jersey, and some about, role and mission of colleges and universities. And the governor became involved, it became politicized. So, how can states deal with that and make sure they're dealing with it in a way that meets educational needs?
No, it is a big challenge. And New Jersey just gets more attention because it's New Jersey and we have a particular kind of governor, but it's across the state. Before I answer that, I would like to just tag an issue that maybe we can come back to later. So I agree with your statement that we know a lot about how to achieve attainment. And it's sad that we haven't made more progress because we know a lot and we should be doing better. I don't think we know a lot about how to improve the quality of education for students, and I just wanted to tag that as something to talk about. And what I mean by quality, I want to be clear about it, is students have skills that when they graduate, they can be successful in the world. And two, that they are lifelong learners, that they continue to learn for the rest of their lives. So that's how I would define it. And one of the problems, of course, is that we don't have a good definition of what's quality. But now getting back to your question.
And not much data about it, but anyway.
And not much data. So, but getting back to your question, I think we also have, you highlighted this, that we have challenges with what we expect out of our universities. And New Jersey is a perfect example of this. So on the good side, New Jersey actually is a leader, in my view, on the issue of financial support for disadvantaged students. And also is a leader on the point that Laura was just raising about the transition between county colleges, what they call them in New Jersey, and four-year colleges. They actually have done a lot of good work in that transition. So try to say some positive things first before you say the negative things. The negative things are that there is both for the policymakers and for the institutional leaders, there's no common understanding of what the role of a university is. So you pointed this out. There's so much mission creep that every university wants to become a research university. Every two-year college wants to become a four-year college. Every four-year college wants to become a graduate granting institution. And there aren't resources to do that, besides for the fact that we're chasing a very select group of students, again, your point about the Cal system, when we're ignoring the overwhelming majority of the students. In New Jersey, one other point, which actually does relate to the conflict that you alluded to, is that there is no state policy leadership. There is no board of higher education in New Jersey. Governor Whitman eliminated it. And there is a secretary of higher education who has an office of 5 people. And the current secretary is a wonderful person, but had been moved from being secretary of K-12 education. And that actually is her expertise. She knows something about that. And the governor just decided to make her the head of higher education. And she admitted that she really had almost no experience in this area. So at the New Jersey, and so getting back to the controversy that you alluded to, the governor led an effort to reorganize Rutgers University and some other parts of the state, including Wharton University. So the higher level institutions really was not applied to the two-year institutions or the other four-year state colleges. But the governor had no guidance from higher education policymakers or leaders who were thinking about what is the best way to structure higher education for students. It was almost all about how do we make these institutions more research-minded and more competitive for federal grants that we all know are declining anyway. So that is a perfect example of the challenge that the policy leaders, and again, they weren't in higher education, they were other policy leaders, had a misunderstanding of what the role of higher education in the state should be, in my opinion. And it was matched by, again, in my view, misunderstanding of these institutions of what their role should be.
Yes, so I'll ask Laura Perner to comment on that in a second. But Laura Wolf-Powers, could you talk a little bit about the policy levers to encourage workforce development, in education attainment, and what's in place, and how these offices of workforce development work with higher education institutions or don't? How does all of this come together at the state level? Well, or even regional level where you've worked?
Well, I'm actually very curious to know how many of the higher education leaders you interviewed mentioned the state departments of labor or state departments of workforce development, because in general those are, it's almost a cliche now to talk about policy silos, but this is a classic example of that, where in general, state departments of education and state departments of labor, even though you'd think that they should be talking to each other all the time, if not actually merging, are kind of in their own worlds, and I think it has to do in part with revenue. When most of the time to a state policy official, when you mention workforce training or job training, their thoughts will turn to a particular federal funding stream known as the Workforce Investment Act, which has been getting smaller and smaller every year, since the mid '80s. Although the Workforce Investment Act itself was just in 1998, but it was a series of job training programs, and that program has really never known whether it's an anti-poverty program or a program that serves business needs. And in any event, the Workforce Investment Act funding is filtered through, it's mediated through the state departments of labor, and then it gets to the local level, to the county and city levels, where it's then used to help people search for jobs, to prepare their resumes, and in some cases to receive sort of short-term occupational training. But I have argued before that this is a broken system that ought to be completely rethought, and I don't have time to elaborate on that argument today. But I do think that that college is often the most promising site for workforce training. Whether it's you're getting a 4-year degree and then you're just prepared to know what you want to do and look for a job, or whether you have a specific vocational path in a college setting. And I don't know as much as I'm sure you guys do about sort of instances where college systems have done workforce training well. I mentioned the North Carolina example, and I'll also sort of speak up for the City University of New York, which has recently instigated a number of initiatives focused on college completion, college attainment, but linked with workforce objectives. And I think that's one of the great legacies, actually, of Mayor Bloomberg's administration in New York City. But that's a city level policy, I suppose.
So, Laura Perner, you can respond to both of these in terms of what we've learned, but also in that response, will you also mention why we landed on these 3 policy areas in our framework?
Sure. So I guess starting with why we landed on these 3 policy.
Of all the policies that you might consider.
Yes. So part of the framing of our conceptualization of this is that governments have certain policy levers that they can use to achieve, and we were trying to think about what are the types of levers available to increase attainment, right? And so attainment is really following a public sector macroeconomic type of perspective. It's the result of the accumulation of demand and supply, right? So what are the policy levers that you can use to increase the demand for higher education? Well, you can make it more affordable, right? Reduce the financial costs. And so what's the bucket of types of different financial types of levers, appropriations, tuition, financial aid in that bucket. A second type of lever that you could use to try to increase the demand for higher education is to ensure that more people are academically qualified and ready to go to higher education. And so that's related to that second preparation and movement of students. That movement of students, to some extent, could be related to a supply-related lever, the extent to which there are available high-quality post-secondary options. So how does a state provide higher education? And that's really related to the optimization of system capacity, right? So I think these buckets correspond to our conceptual understanding, at least what we proposed in the book, about how we think government can matter in this type of issue. Now it's interesting to think about, policies related to workforce development. And this came up to varying degrees in our state. So I'll just offer briefly 2 examples of how it came up. In Washington State, there's a very strong community and technical college sector. I think there are 34 institutions located throughout the state. It's very well regarded politically. It's regarded as being responsive to the needs of the states. They have a small performance funding system in place, and so it's seen to be accountable. The problem in Washington is that they need more bachelor's degrees, right? So they have high completion rates for the very small number of people who go to a four-year college, but they need, given the nature of the employment and things like that, they have to figure out a way to ensure that if you start in a community college, you can get into complete a bachelor's degree in a more efficient type of mechanism. And so one of the strategies they've adopted is to allow community colleges to award applied bachelor's degrees, which are kind of in that workforce orientation as well. We raised some questions about implications for mission creep and things like that. And Washington's not the only state that now allows community colleges to award bachelor's degrees, so that's a broader question there. The other issue where workforce issues came up was in Georgia. Really interesting, very strong orientation in Georgia towards workforce preparation. I think Georgia leads the nation in terms of the number of certificates awarded. So a very strong orientation. And other types of programs, they have something called the Quick Start program that's designed to help providing state money to help provide training for workers associated with particular employers. One of the challenges we point to is it's almost like two systems. So there's a strong technical college system that's fun with the Hope Grant, the Hope Grant, which is, we talk a lot about the Hope Scholarship, but Georgia historically has had a very large Hope Grant program, which is available to people. It used to be when they had enough lottery funding. They've made some changes recently to change this, but no academic requirements, no income requirements. If you were in a non-degree program, you got it paid for by the Hope Grant. One of the problems we point to is that it's a very separate system than the degree granting institutions, and so it was on trimesters rather than semesters. The accreditation varied. So if you started in one track, so disproportionately low-income students of color in this track towards workforce preparation, very difficult to switch to a degree granting track for structural reasons and the availability of financial aid, right? So the Hope Scholarship goes to folks who meet the academic criteria. So interesting to think about this is really a question that we raise throughout the book. What are the priorities of the state? Could be that workforce preparation and short-term certificates could have some value, but in this, when we look at the data to see the growing demand for folks who have at least an associate's degree, it raises a question with regard to that, which comes to the points about state policy leadership. So really interesting, it's one of the points we raise is that the structures that we have had in place to govern and coordinate higher education were really established for an earlier time, right, when we were interested in growing our higher education system. One of the observations from several of our states is movement towards shifting of the responsibility for making decisions about higher education from a state agenda to an institutional agenda. And so interesting, New Jersey doesn't have any really centralized state body looking out for higher education. In Illinois, one of the reasons behind the story of decline, well, one of the things that happened, we're not drawing causality, but was the dismantling of the system of systems, right? And so with that, Illinois used to have a board, a higher education commission, and a system of systems that had, a smaller number of people who held positions for a long time and were looking out for statewide goals of higher education. With the dismantling of the system of systems, more decision makers, as you might expect, the priorities and goals of institutions are not necessarily the same of the states, right? We saw the same thing in Washington. So shortly after we left, the legislature dissolved the Higher Education Commission. And part of the, we quote in the book, one of the justifications was we wanted to shift the policy-making authority to the public four-year institutions. And so we just raised a question about, so who is looking out for the statewide interests when you are trying to figure out what we want from higher education? So we don't have the answer what that's going to look like, but it certainly is an important need, I think.
Yeah.
So I want to go off script actually here. Instead of our third round of question, get back to Wendell's question about, we don't know much about the quality of our degrees or what students are learning. and ask Wendell if he's suggesting that we ought to know that in some systematic way.
Yes. So, so yeah, it is a big challenge. It strikes me that some policymakers are starting to ask that question, and the debate, for example, over the report cards for colleges that the Obama administration has talked about, and there has been lots of pushback because people are very worried about, and I think rightfully so, about how you might do that. As you pointed out, Joni, we don't really know how to do that, but I feel that we won't make enough progress on the question of meaningful attainment until we have more progress on the question of what we want students to actually know when they get out. Because in my experience, while there is certainly support for higher education and an understanding that it is important to the country's success, there's a lot of skepticism about what actually goes on in universities, about the value of higher education, and I think that's true about the general public. It's true in the business community, and I think that those two things are interrelated. So if we can show the value, the quality, I think we will have more success in getting support around the resources that are necessary to achieve the attainment. So that's why I think as a practical matter, quality is important. We can put aside the philosophical issue that, obviously people should have something meaningful in their lives, and if they're paying a lot of money, or if we're paying a lot of money, we should get something out of it. But I think there's actually a practical question that I just laid out, which is that in order to actually achieve the resources we need for attainment, we have to show more value than we're showing right now.
Laura Kerner, do you want to respond to that in terms of how states thought about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when you do these types of studies, it's interesting what people talk about and what they don't talk about, right? So we heard in all of our states an interest around the value question in terms of performance funding. So all of our states, in some form or fashion, were raising the possibility of trying to hold higher education institutions accountable for their performance by somehow linking funding to those institutions. But we did not hear any conversation around learning, measuring learning.
Right.
It wasn't.
It's as if college completion is the proxy for that.
Right,
But
and it's
Laura
not, yeah.
Powers, in your area, is actual employment the proxy for that? Successful employment in the workforce with the groups that you work with?
You're asking if the measure of educational quality is
Success, yeah.
employability?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I think there are so many things, though, that go into making someone employable. And it's very hard to kind of parse out, to what extent you're employable because you're holding a piece of paper, and to what extent you're employable because you're holding a piece of paper from the University of Pennsylvania as opposed to the Community College of Philadelphia, and to what extent you're employable because you took accounting rather than modern poetry, right? And so I think that these are the questions that they're certainly people who are in the economic development field, the sort of workforce development field, do think about those questions, but in some ways, their goal is very instrumental, and that has to do with really does somebody have the sort of set of credentials, whatever those are? It's a combination of educational attainment, soft skills, ability to pass some kind of exam, et cetera, et cetera. And then the measure is, okay, so what's the return on that in terms of their earnings, and what are they? So how good of a job can they get, and how well are they being paid, and are they achieving economic mobility through that? So somehow the learning aspects, or measuring the quality of learning, gets lost in that as well, because you're just looking at how much money people are making in their jobs. So I guess I don't necessarily have a satisfying answer to that question.
Yeah, and I think what we heard is, since the focus for many of these states is on raising education attainment, that was seen as really the proxy
For employability.
for learning and for employability. Yeah, so, but I think I'd rather open it up to our audience now, and we've given you enough to hopefully whet your appetite. And if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and just identify yourself, and we'll go from there. Yes?
Montez. Just kind of talking about what you just spoke about, educational quality, and you're using, well, loosely using the job market and your higher ability and kind of your quality of life after that. So what do you say about those people who don't go to four-year institutions and go to like a trade school and, you know, develop hireable qualities from that type of training? And what is the value of that type of training as it relates to post-secondary education? Because not everyone's gonna go to college, but is it just as valuable for those people to go and get that professional training? It's a multi-layered question, sorry.
No, I'm just thinking about it. It's a, are you asking if we should be focused on trade school to a larger degree than we are now?
Yeah, like, is it, in what you're thinking about right now, does the trade school play a role in post-secondary education? And loosely speaking, would you even attach that idea
To higher
to higher
education policy?
education and kind of the quality of life that a person can live?
Well, I mean, I think that going back again to the notion that states should have a vision for how they want their educational system, higher educational systems to look, and the goal that they want them to serve, for not for the institutions, but for the students and for the economic trajectory of that state. You know, that there should be a lot of deep thinking going on about how trade schools fit into that, and whether those are. You know, I think there are really good examples of where trade schools, and I gave one earlier about the North Carolina system, where trade schools can play an extremely important role, and they can actually influence employers. Again, like, so if you know, why is it that you have to have a bachelor's degree to get a good job now, right? You know, if you have skills and you have a 2-year degree, then shouldn't that be enough? So I think that can be kind of integrated into state higher education policy. I mean, I also think, though, that, and this gets to what Laura was saying about the dual tracking system in Georgia, that often trade schools are a kind of, you know, a sort of holding pattern place for people who are not really considered to be economically and socially as equal. And I think that can be, so it's all a question of how trade school policy kind of fits into your broader vision for lifting everybody up through education.
Okay, Laura, do you want to respond to that as well?
Sure. So I believe the data that show the benefits of having some college degree, not necessarily a bachelor's degree. I think you're raising an issue, though, that hasn't that needs more attention in terms of what the values of different types of credentials might be to different people along the pipeline. You know, one of the things along the lines of what folks didn't say in our interviews was we heard very little attention to the for-profits in our interviews with state-level people, with the exception of Illinois, who was really talked about what a regulatory burden they are. That's pretty, and how that need to regulate was actually diverting time available from more policy-oriented types of activities. But you know, when you see the growth of for-profits and you see I think it's something that needs more attention, just to try to understand what are the values and contributions or not of different types of sectors in the short term and the long term, along the lines of things that we didn't really hear that much about. When we started the project, we had is one of our goals to look at is the mechanisms in place to improve education attainment for adults. And we don't, if you look at it, we have so little to say in the book about that because it's not really part of the conversation. And so I think that's another potentially related area to what you're saying.
Well, it certainly was in the state of Georgia because many students in the technical college system are adults. And, you know, it also depends on what, you know, the state's economy. What kind of education does a population need at that point in time? And in Georgia, they have really created a trade school system, or it's not called trade schools, technical college system that really prepares people for high-level manufacturing jobs. This is not, your grandfather's welding shop. They have biotech companies coming in. They have aerospace industries, automotive industries. And so folks are being prepared, and they're moving, and these are middle-class jobs, so it's very important. The challenge in Georgia is that if these students want to further their education beyond a workforce certificate, the University System of Georgia recognizes almost none of their credits, and there's no pathway. And it's been of, great concern and frustration to elected officials in this state. So I think trade school plays an important role. We have to understand more about the economic returns, but it's also driven by the economy of a state and where the population is in terms of education attainment. Kat.
Hi, I'm Kat. I was actually curious about whether anything came up in your conversations around competency-based education at all, because it seems to me when you're talking about vocational technical schools, a lot of times we're talking about competency-based stuff. I can do X, Y, and Z versus I learned how to read poetry and I can write an analytical essay. And then you see the rise of places like Western Governors where it is competency-based, and some states, Washington, are deciding that this is an important way for their adults to complete higher education. So where does competency-based education kind of fit into everything that's been discussed here, or does it?
So that's a really good question. We had two states where WGU came in. One is Washington State, because students could not transfer from the 2-year system into the 4-year system. They don't have a robust, they don't have enough community or enough public 4-year institutions in the right part of the state. They expanded the research sector, they take too few students, and it's very expensive. When we were there, the transfer destination of choice was the University of Phoenix. When we called back to follow up on the study, the transfer destination became Western Governors. So it wasn't because of competency-based education, but it was because they were willing to work with those students and make sure they could get through the pipeline. The same is true in Texas, although that effort was not as well developed as one in Washington. So it didn't come up much. Again, I think this idea of education attainment, we've made a national conversation about education attainment and not about learning. And, there's a difference.
Joanne, can I add something that links the two questions? So I'm going to posit something which I believe pretty strongly. We don't have enough educational institutions right now to achieve the attainment goals that we want to achieve. So right now, we don't have the ability to actually increase significantly. I think that's pretty obvious. The second question, I think, second statement is a little bit more debated, but I think it's also pretty obvious. Even if we increased resources to all of the institutions that we had, they couldn't ramp up and structure themselves in a way to significantly increase the attainment, at least not to the level that I think we want to have, right?
Yeah.
So those two statements being true, and those are sad statements, but I think they're the reality, that we need to think about, this is linking your two questions, we need to think about other kinds of institutions that are also going to help us attain the level of education that we want to attain in this country. So that opens up in my mind a conversation about competency-based, about technical education, about lots of other things, because if we don't do that, we're never going to achieve the goals that Joni and Laura laid out in their book, in my view.
So Lindo, I want to take you on a little bit on that first point. We don't have, enough institutions to do the job. Part of what we have observed, that I've observed in other work that I've done is about system capacity is that it is not optimized. We don't run these campuses 12 months a year, evenings, weekends. We don't think about a 3-year degree for people who come in who are exceptionally well prepared. We haven't made smart use of technology. I guess I can't answer the question of do we have enough institutions, because we are so far from operating at an optimal capacity level.
No, I completely agree with that statement. And that was my personal experience in trying. So let's not even talk about summer, just to try to offer classes on Friday and Saturday. That was one thing that we fought about constantly. So, but I guess I would respond by linking it to my second statement, which is partly about what you were just saying, is that the current institutions aren't structured in a way to expand dramatically the attainment that we want to achieve.
Yeah.
So yes, I agree with you. In principle, we could get our existing institutions to expand significantly the number of students that they serve. But that would take dramatic changes, and I'll repeat that it took me 3 years as chancellor to get us to offer classes on Friday.
So what
So,
could the state
it's a-
have done to help you in that? I mean, so that you're not, walking in to the faculty meeting telling them they have to teach on Friday.
Yeah,
I
no.
know how that would go in. Geez.
Well, we did it, but it took
And
3
I
years.
teach on Friday, not this semester.
So, well, I think that the state can be more directive, and I'll come back to an area where I think New Jersey did make progress. So the state, unlike Washington State, which you studied, the state said 4-year colleges that we fund must take transfers and must make it easy to be a transfer student. And as a result, I think we made a lot of progress on that because the state laid out a structure, which is actually fairly cumbersome because it was a legislative and bureaucratic answer to a problem that we could have solved internally on our own much smoother, right? But they told us we have to do it. And I think that New Jersey is better off because of it. So the answer to your question is the state could mandate it and say you're not going to get funding unless you do these things. But I am leery or wary of having that level of state intervention. I mean, if you look at the transfer regulations that the state published in New Jersey, they are pretty detailed. So I don't know if we could do that in every area.
Avoid it, right? Yeah. I mean, so Laura, how did our states handle the transfer dilemma?
Right, so it varied across states. In a lot of places, it's still individual institutions negotiating with each other, which you can imagine how difficult that is from a student perspective. In Maryland, similarly, although it doesn't sound like it's quite as regulated, there's an understanding around transferability from the 2-year institutions to the 4-year institutions. One of the issues still is with the loss of credit. So there's a guaranteed acceptance into a public 4-year institution, not necessarily the 4-year institution of your choice, and not necessarily all the credits that you've taken. So that's still an issue. In Maryland, though, and in Texas, they have articulated a few different degree programs so that if you complete an Associate of Arts in Teaching and in Engineering in Maryland, then that whole degree transfers to the 4-year institutions. I was at Maryland actually when some of those early conversations were happening, and it's just so difficult to get faculty to agree on these things. But that is something, that's a mechanism that's really helpful from a student perspective and improves the efficiency of our system when you have that alignment.
Okay, Kata, and then over here.
Hi, I'm Kata, and I have a question about the mobility of human capital. You mentioned earlier in the presentation that Washington has a high level of educational attainment in the state, that it actually imports a lot of the highly educated people in the state. And one of the premises of your research is that the states have the political leverage and the economic leverage to influence public policy and increase educational attainment, but at the same time, state borders are open. To a certain extent, international borders are also open. So I would imagine that complicates this matter quite a bit, and I was wondering whether throughout your research this matter came up, and if so, to what extent and in what format.
So in Washington is the clearest example of our 5 states of importing folks with a bachelor's degree. Certainly it could be a state policy structure to try to attract, not do the education at home and try to attract people from outside the state. I guess it raises a question about, how well, but it raises the question, how well, what is the state obligation for raising the educational attainment and ensuring the well-being of its own citizens, right? So that would be a policy type of trade-off.
So I think for public institutions, Kata, this is a very, a raw nerve for legislators to talk about admitting out-of-state students or international students when their own residents who are qualified are being displaced because of the state support for post-secondary education, and not just state support any one year, but the historical state support that built and allowed these systems of higher education to be developed and created. So this is a really political hot potato, and it is going to be a battle that I think is waged in many state legislatures across the country about the percentage of out-of-state students, they're allowed to admit because of a public mission to that state and to the state's residents, particularly for states that are growing. Okay, I'm going to go over here.
Hi, my name is Carrie. I had a
Carrie,
quick question.
yes.
You may have answered it partially earlier, but I know at the federal level there is this move and this push to increase the number of American citizens with higher education, and they're focusing on that through community colleges primarily. Do you see that there's an urgency within four-year colleges and research institutions to figure out how to streamline all of these associate degrees to four-year programs?
So to some extent, that's related to the transfer, the policies that are in place to improve transfer. With our study, just a general approach that we took in our studies, we were trying to understand how the institutions as a collective within a state were operating to offer higher education opportunity rather than look at the practices of particular institutions, although we did interview people at particular types of institutions. Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything else to add about the transfer issues that I didn't already say.
That's right. I think there are a lot of states that are happy if students, sort of move through the associate degree, because if you look at the education, if you look at Tony Carnevale's work, the Center at Georgetown for Workforce and the Economy, most of the demand is really pre-baccalaureate. From workforce certificates through the associates. And then, a fair amount is also baccalaureate in terms of addressing the needs of the economy. So I think the importance of pathways, we heard a lot about, making sure students could move through the system if they needed more education became very important.
Just one related point about the perspective of four-year institutions in the state. So in Washington, we've raised Washington a number of times in terms of just the challenges of moving through the system. One of the things that we heard from the institutions in Washington, and there are some state mandates around accepting transfer students there, but the cost of educating folks at the upper division level is higher, and so from their perspective, they don't really want transfer students. They'd rather have first-year students who are less expensive. And so figuring out, again, how the system as a whole works is really important, but wasn't happening there.
Okay, the top row, and then we'll come over here to the first.
Yeah, so I was curious.
Name, please.
Sorry, Simon Burton. I was curious about the funding sources of the states. How much have they taken on student loan funding and student grants on themselves as opposed to leaving it to the federal government? And then how does the breakup between the 2-year and the 4-year institutions look? And how much is that actually driven by policy, or is it causing the policy and kind of the policy context that we're looking at?
So you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so two of our states, Washington and Illinois, have historically had long-standing, strong commitments to awarding state-funded need-based financial aid. So the Monetary Assistance Program in Illinois been one of the hallmarks of what in the early 90s, measuring up, the report card that Joni developed, gave Illinois an A for affordability, right? In part because the availability of this state-funded financial aid program. One of the things that we saw in the state, now we were collecting data at what felt like the height of the recession. You know, it was all people could talk about and interesting and influenced things in a lot of ways. But what we found in Illinois was a drastic, there wasn't enough money being allocated to the monetary assistance program, and so they had shortfalls when they had the amount of money versus those eligible. So one of the decisions they made was to award that aid on a first-come, first-served basis. Right, so think about the consequences of that. Who applies first? The people who know the most, who are most savvy about the system. Who applies late? The people in the community colleges, the older students, the ones who most need the money, likely, right? And so that was a worrisome trend. Similarly, in Washington, they have the need-based grant program and a state-funded work-study program as well. Similarly, declines in the extent to which those state-funded financial aid programs that have historically helped to keep college affordable have been unable to keep up in terms of helping to ensure the affordability of college. You asked a lot of things in that question. That was the one.
You know, it's also the issue of how you distribute money to students versus institutions. And states aren't having good conversations about that right now. And institutions would rather have the money. In fact, a lot of institutions are making the case we can do financial aid better rather than the state. You know, so it's where does the money go initially first? What are you trying to achieve? And that's part of that circle, the strategic use of resources, where we really need to have more debate about that and think about what we're trying to do, and then the finance mechanisms to get us from here to there.
And then also recognizing that happens in a political context, right? So in Maryland, we praised Maryland in terms of having a public shared conversation around the need to improve college affordability. And there's been progress in terms of aligning appropriations, thinking about tuition increases, linking them to increases in family income. They haven't really figured out the financial aid part. So they have something like 20 separate financial aid programs that they just can't cut down on because they're all tied to different political constituencies. So how do you figure out how to use the resources you have to address state priorities it's a challenge.
And
I'm Edward. What is your sense, and I know that this is beyond the scope of your study, but of how these states stack up against ones that are similar geographically and demographically, like Georgia versus Alabama and Mississippi, for example?
yeah. So my sense is, you know, in Alabama and Mississippi, you would find the performance lower, and probably not as much state policy leadership right now in place to address some of these issues. I think Arkansas, you know, there's more state policy leadership being provided at this point in time. So I think Georgia is much more representative of this group of southern states than, say, Maryland is, you know, or Texas, you know. So it's similar in that sense. And it's also similar in that almost every state in the South, every SREB state, Southern Region Education Board state, has merit-based financial aid rather than need-based financial aid, favors merit-based financial aid. And so it has that similarity. Many of them rely heavily on community colleges to enroll students. But I think the state policy leadership problems are still there. They all share that in common. And what has happened, I mean, we built this system, as Laura said, after World War II. Clark Kerr started with the California Master Plan for Higher Education, the first planned system in the country, followed not long after that by the System of Systems, Lyman Glennie in Illinois, and Rockefeller in New York, the CUNY and SUNY systems, these planned systems to dramatically increase levels of education attainment. and there was policy leadership for growth. We knew where we wanted to go. And the goals of institutions and the goals of the state were much closer than they are now. Now we have very powerful, excellent research universities, research sector, and in some states, particularly California, I'm thinking, that's trying to virtually take all the resources, as, the old saying, he who holds 4 aces doesn't call for a new deal, So how do you begin to balance public interests with the institutional aspirations that are out there? And I'm not saying we pull money away from research universities. Wendell's right. We are spreading this money too thin. We're actually hurting major research universities because we need to concentrate our resources to maintain quality. And states aren't thinking strategically about that. It's every legislator has to have something in his and her backyard. But they haven't created these coordinating boards and these what we call these steering mechanisms and bodies that are an interface between government and higher education that have the sole responsibility of articulating a public interest, that aren't, responsible to institutions. And they have to be responsible to government, but can say things, have appointments to boards, that are long enough to exceed any, one governor's term or something like that. We just need some civic capacity to deal with these sorts of public issues that I think we're lacking. Okay, I got 2 right here.
Yeah,
So.
my question was related to that. Whose responsibility do you think it is to avoid mission creep as drawbacks? Is it one institutions? Is it the states?
Well, it's a shared responsibility. The bottom line, though, I would define this as a political problem. This requires leadership from the executive and legislative branches of government. Or this is not going to happen. We're all going to have to live with the consequences of a system at drift that is going to be very expensive and serve fewer students, and serve them probably not as well.
Serve the already privileged students.
So, yes.
My name's Jennifer. I was wondering, going back sort of towards the beginning when you were talking about students' preparedness for higher education, and also we've mentioned different types of institutions and what's right for me isn't right for the next person, et cetera. What evidence did you see during your research of conversations between K-12 schools and higher ed in any of these states? Was it, are there any entities in place, or is it just, I happen to be a K-12 person in Illinois and you happen to be a higher ed person and we're friends and we're talking about it, or was there really any kind of structure to that?
It's such a good question, and we really did probe this. Part of the premise is that the pathway to higher education attainment starts much before folks enter college. So we did talk to people at the K through 12 level. So one of our observations is that all 5 of our states have had at one time some entity with a name like P16 Commission, P20 Commission, K16, blah, blah, all variations of that type of name. One of our conclusions is that these entities have resulted in very little policy change. So one of the most striking comments for me that I heard was that one of the accomplishments of these entities was that they could get people in a room to meet. Right? That's a pretty low bar for success.
That's the truth.
Right? The disconnect between K through 12 in higher education, I think, is one of the most persisting, important problems that we have. It's just not right that you should be able to graduate from high school with a high school diploma and not be prepared, not be ready to enter college level courses at a public 4-year institution. It's really a big, big problem. So one of the findings has to do with, we have had structures in place, but they have not been effective in addressing this issue. The other thing that we heard, which is increasingly troubling as time goes by, is that states were waiting and seeing how the Common Core state standards were going to play out, and I don't know whether they were hoping, but they were telling us that they were hoping that would be the solution, and, you know, as we watch that roll out, I'm not sure that's where we should have our eggs either.
And ask you, the three of you, a quick follow-up question. So I spent a bunch of time in Tennessee over the last few years, and it struck me that that was a place that is thinking about this continuum, and I don't know whether maybe my standards are so low that it's just a little bit better.
Yeah.
But it struck me that that was a state that was thinking about this stuff.
Well, of our states, Texas was doing the most work in this area, and they had opted out of Common Core state standards. So interesting, Texas is its own place.
That's an understatement.
Yeah, I lived in Texas for a while. I didn't really fit in there that well. So they had made some progress in terms of identifying end-of-course exams and trying to figure out this alignment and shared understanding of what the expectations are. But we'll see, it's still in progress also.
Yeah, Roman, and we'll go up here.
Hi, my name is Roman, and I have a question sort of about where the decision-making and policy levers should be. I've heard some people talk about, you know, New Jersey, for example, is a disbanded the Coordinating Board for Higher Education, and it seems like you would be an advocate for having, you know, a larger master plan. But if legislatures are ineffective, or if there's huge geographic and economic diversity within the state, I know, Laura, you mentioned context matters at the state. Well, does context also matter within different regions or pockets in one state? So my question is there a tipping point of where policy leverage should be? Is there something that should be done at the regional level, or is there instances where it'd be more effective if institutions or, you know, small units within the larger master plan for education within the state are more effective in decision making?
Well, I think you're edging on the question of changes in governance that could actually take place in some states, whether it be a more effective coordinating structure, whether there be regional structures that work together. And it seems to me, you know, governance didn't end up being one of the actual policy levers we have on the framework here, but governance, we looked at as sort of part of state context. It's hard to change, but my sense is if a state can't do these things, they've got to make changes in governance. That's sort of where I came down. This is not research-based at all. But, you know, if you can't get the job done, something fundamentally has to change, and you've got to be able to empower, you know, institutions and people to do it. And we have done it before in the past. And so I think it can be done. But again, this is really something that requires political leadership. And it's why it's so important to get governors engaged in higher education. It's really down on their list because of all the things that are going wrong in the state. You know, they got that good research university or, you know, a good community college in their district. So
It seems like there has to be some kind of mechanism. So Texas is really like 5 or 6 different states, and they value local control, right? So that's just part of the culture. But in Texas, of our states, it has a master plan that's embraced called Closing the Gaps, and it's something that really is being implemented. They're monitoring progress towards achieving those milestones, and they're adjusting as necessary. The challenge is that there's a competing priority, and so how do you figure out, well, if you have only so much money, how do you figure out how much money to allocate to closing achievement gaps versus building research, allocating more funding to the research universities. Just the other quick point I want to make is that having a plan is not enough. So we went to Illinois, and they have the most beautiful document you could ever imagine, the Public Agenda for Higher Education. It's multicolor, it has great graphics, it's just gorgeous, right? And they were so proud of the process, right? It involved everybody you could imagine was involved in developing this master plan. But it didn't reflect shared priorities. We talked to others, you know, legislators, others, and it was like, this doesn't really matter. And it had it had every conceivable recommendation you could ever think of. How do you understand which of those zillion things to actually do when you have to do something first? And so a plan is important, but you have to have it be shared. You have to have some mechanism for building shared understanding and then implementing what it is you want to do.
So I'm gonna have time for just one more question, and then I'm gonna ask each of the panelists just to make a very quick closing statement about their thoughts. Yes.
Yeah, Jonathan here. I suppose I just had a couple of questions around some tensions in education. A couple I think of are, I suppose, an outcomes-based approach to education versus the intrinsic value of education itself, and following on from that, whether you tailor higher education so that students can study what they're passionate about, versus, asking students to study things that will lead to tangible, employment outcomes. So what did you observe in different states in their approach to that area?
Well, for the most part, I think states allowed market forces to work in terms of what students study. Now, I don't think market forces work very well in terms of the type of institution, so there's sort of a contradiction in what I'm saying, because poorer and minority students were found disproportionately in for-profit sector and community colleges and technical colleges. But states didn't really try to control where students would study, what kind of studies they would do. There's not a grand master plan there saying we need X number of engineers, X number of this or that. I don't know if I answered the question.
Well, so one of the interesting things for me, while we were trying to figure out what we knew from our states, Joni and I co-taught a class in Ireland, and was basically testing out our model in Ireland. One of the observations, which is if you're familiar with Ireland, pretty much everything depends on how well you do in the high school leaving exam. It channels you by major into an institution, and the system at that time was structured to fund you for 4 years. So all the incentives were do well on the test, don't match to your institution, and don't change your major field, and finish in 4 years, right? That would never work in the US, right? Because we value choice, and so we have a system that is inherently set up to supposedly benefit the student by making all these choices. But if we're going to value choice, we actually have to have it benefit students. We have so it's a figuring out that our system has certain values embedded in it. And so part of what we need to think about is how to unpack that and make sure that those values don't work to the disadvantage of people who have actually limited choice.
Okay, just a quick final comment from each of our panelists.
Want to go first, then, Paul?
Oh, okay. So first of all, practical thing, for my students, I'm giving you off the next 25 minutes, so we don't have to go to 6:30. But I'll probably take it back some other time. So see you next week. So I want to respond to the second to last question about the regional implications. So I completely agree with Joni and Laura that the change has to happen at the state level for a lot of reasons, but mainly because that's where the money is. And that's why I think this is a great book in trying to lead that. But it's interesting to me in thinking about your question, there are a lot of efforts at the the regional level to try to increase attainment. And it's interesting to me that the Lumina Foundation decided to fund a bunch of them, and haven't really, in my mind, been that deeply involved, and they're the biggest funder for education policy, or one of them at least. They haven't really been involved, at least as I know, about the states.
They've done some funding, but it's more around very targeted, they want everybody to do performance funding.
Yeah, but then the second related point is that we also talked a little bit about the fact that the federal government is trying to involve itself, at least this administration is, in ways that I don't think it really understands either. So it's just kind of ironic to me that the right place is the state, I completely agree with you, and in one way it seems like there's more activity at two other levels. So that's my closing thought.
Okay, good.
I guess my closing thought has to do with something that didn't come up as much today, but there are actually, over 20% of the working age population is college stopouts, people who have some college but no degree. So there are people who manage to get to college and enroll in college, and then something happens while they're there that, and I think it has to do with financing, to the point that the person in the back, people just didn't realize how expensive it was. They didn't realize they were going to have to pay to live in addition to paying their tuition, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I think some of the Lumina Foundation efforts that Wendell may be referring to are actually oriented toward getting stopouts to come back to school and complete, which I think is a really interesting and rich area for further study. And the other thing that I'd say is that I would love for you to write a book about what it would look like if these P to 16 commissions were to take their mandate seriously. Like, what would that look like if you really, tried to exert leadership that conceived of the education pipeline, starting at pre-K and ending it with a four-year degree.
That's good, thank you. So I want to start by thanking you for your engagement and thanking you for joining on the panel in this discussion. This has been really fun. I hope that you'll continue to think about these issues. I think there's some fundamental types of questions that I hope that we've tried to advance the conversation about, but there's still so much more work to be done. So how does a state strategically use the fiscal resources available to improve higher education attainment for all students? How do we figure out how to bridge these structural disconnects that we have in our higher education system and our educational system more generally, the gaps between K through 12 and higher education? How do we figure out how to use all the different types of post-secondary options to achieve these types of goals? How do we ensure equity when these things all come together? And how do we increase or rethink? I think there's a rethinking of the role of state policy leadership that's important here, and so I hope that you'll take that on as part of your charge moving forward.
Yes, all I can add to that is it's both a very daunting and a very exciting time to work in higher education policy if you're so inclined. The problems are there waiting for your generation to solve them, since people my generation, maybe Wendell's too, helped create some of them. So, but I also want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Andy for hosting this terrific event and giving us a chance to share our findings. So thank you.